Thank you. SLSA Dependency Track, quick project update. Yes, so what's interesting about this update is that for this track in SLSA, we're trying a slightly new model, piloting a new model. The model is that we establish a dedicated task force that will be working on the track. And then once the task force is ready with the first draft of a track, we will come back to the broader community and to the steering committee, and we'll present that there. And so this is sort of a little update on how our work has been going and some of the things we've landed on. And so the work has been done by Adrian from Microsoft, Tom from Bloomberg, and myself. We'll all speak a little bit today about effectively SLSA, a brief introduction and refresher what SLSA is. I think there is a couple of interesting nuances in there that are very important to keep in mind as we talk about the dependency track. We'll talk about some of the risks that we had to keep in mind and how SC2CF and other frameworks have fit into this partnership between SLSA and SC2CF. And then at the end, Tom will walk us through the actual dependency levels that we currently have. So without further ado, let's jump into what SLSA is. What is SLSA? So SLSA is this interesting framework. It stands for Supply Chain Levels for Software Artifacts, pronounced as SLSA, right? First, it's opinionated, right? So it sort of expresses a set of requirements and a checklist, in some cases, the way we want you to meet certain requirements. So there we express sort of opinions around which threats matter and how you should be addressing them. Secondly, it's modular. As you can now see, SLSA initially started as the build track. That's what everyone associates it with. But as you can tell now, there is now already a source track and now is a dependency track, right? So sort of trying to achieve separation of concerns and cover different aspects of supply chain security, right? What's interesting is that very first 0.1 release of SLSA, if you look back, actually covered a bunch of interesting things, and that comes from sort of its origin as being this Google's framework. And because Google operates in the monorepo, a lot of those interesting biases of monorepo came through in the v01 of that, right? Once that was identified and we start splitting things into tracks, things got a lot better. Third point is that it's artifact-centric. Your organization doesn't become SLSA level 3. Right? What it is, it's a specific artifact that you've built at a point in time. That, in turn, gets SLSA level, whether it's a build, source, or dependency track. So that's an important thing to keep in mind in the context of the dependency track. Where we're talking about levels, it's not levels of your dependencies that you're using, but it's levels for the artifact you're producing and practices you're following and how you consume and control those dependencies. And lastly, it's progressive, right? We want to move from levels. We want to go from easier levels to harder levels, eventually getting you from good enough to as robust as you can possibly be. Sweet. What are some of the challenges? Well, when we talk about dependencies, first of all, it turns out everyone consumes open source dependencies in very different ways, right? So we have really big fork here in terms of source code vendoring and using package managers like NPM and PyPy. That's one big sort of difference in there. In some cases, people consume pre-built binaries from the internet, right? Whether it's Node.js runtime or Python runtime. There's also open and closed source dependencies, right? Furthermore, when we consume dependencies from certain ecosystems, they actually have different governance models, right? From fully decentralized like NPM to more managed like Debian, and each of them have different risk profiles. And if you exist in one of those universes only, you may be only exposed to a very small subset of threats that maybe NPM and Python users are exposed to a lot more different threats in that space, right? Very diverse set of tooling and client-side capabilities. You know, some tools support pinning, some tools support materializing the full transitive dependency graph. Some tools don't, like Maven, for example, right? So we had to also account for that. And very diverse set of threats, right? And what's interesting about it, some of the more fundamental threats don't have a solution, right? If you look at XZ as an incident, is one of the threats this malicious committer problem we have to think about, but fundamentally there is no solution to this problem, right? Because static analysis doesn't work, and yeah, we just have to sort of, there is no solution, we can end that. So some of the threats and that we have to consider while we're looking at this, right? I think known vulnerabilities is on everyone's mind. So of course, how do you deal with known vulnerabilities in your software? How you stay up to date? Compromised dependencies, that comes in a lot of different flavors, from hijack dependencies brought by attackers to dependencies whose developers have gone rogue, maintainers have gone rogue, like XZ would be in that category, right? Various forms of activism and compromised artifacts. Furthermore, we have things like dependency confusion, which fall into this opportunistic misconfiguration category of attacks, which many organizations have actually sort of lived experience dealing with, right? Abandoned dependencies. And last one, but not least one that we tend to forget is availability, right? We sort of take it for granted as we do development, but there were several incidents that actually remind us that just because something exists there today doesn't mean it's going to be there tomorrow, right? And infrastructure can go down, etc. So, given all of that, the brief for SLSA Dependency Track for us was, hey, given all of those different consumption patterns, we need to make sure that dependency track works for all of them, right? Whether you're vendoring, whether you're using package managers, it should work nicely and apply to all of that. We need to actually balance meaningful risk reduction, but also ensuring that people with different risk appetites are able to sort of deal with risk the way they want to deal with it, and we can set some sort of minimum bar. So with that, I'll pass it over to Adrian, who will tell us about SU2CF and how that partnership worked.
Yeah. Thanks, Mentor. Yeah. All right, so I'm here to tell you a little bit about the origin story of and how we brought these things together. So first, S2C2F, Secure Supply Chain Consumption Framework. This is a project created under the open source software's supply chain working group, and which is also the same working group that SLSA is a part of. And this was originally contributed by Microsoft in 2022, and it was hyper-focused on how to securely consume dependencies into the developer's workflow. So it was a consumption-focused framework, whereas at the time, SLSA was a very producer-focused framework. So the two could be paired together. You could use SLSA and S2C2F at the same time. S2C2F was also very hyper-focused on here are the real-world threats that have actually happened, and here are the requirements that would mitigate against those threats. So it was very rooted in threats that have actually happened and giving you practical guidance. The S2C2F was organized into 8 different practices. That's that wheel over there. And within each practice is a set of requirements on things that you could do better within each of those practice areas. And then we organized all of those requirements into 4 maturity levels. So I'm kind of just giving you some background about the S2C2F. And what's great is it's actually been out there for some time. There's actually been organizations that have been adopting and embracing S2C2F. Has some noteworthy mentions. There's an entire chapter dedicated to the S2C2F framework in the Software Transparency book, as well as the NSA Enduring Security Framework referenced the S2C2F guidance as industry-specific guidance that aligns with their philosophies that they put out as well. And so all of that is to say that the S2C2F has been out there. It's recognized and has been providing great recommendations on what organizations can do to protect themselves. But the problem was the OpenSSF has a large portfolio of thought leadership and portfolio of different tools and stuff, and the S2C2F was still separated from SLSA, and it was hard for people to find, well, where is all the guidance that I need to follow? Can we just put it all under one roof? And that's exactly what we did. So we leveraged the S2C2F and all of the best practices that it had to create the SLSA Dependency Track, and the kind of, looking at the trail of breadcrumbs, the work stream was originally created in SLSA way back in 2023, and that work stream was just trying to figure out how to scope the problem. What is the bounds that the dependency track is going to cover in terms of guidance for developers? And then later in 2024, like literally 1 year from today, we brought forward that we wanted the S2C2F to align with SLSA to become its dependency track. And that's why. So we had a fun process of salsifying the S2C2F. This was interesting because there's notable differences here with the framework of requirements that S2C2F had versus how SLSA conveys the requirements. And I just wanted to step through some of those. So one of the exercises that we went through collaboratively on this journey was, let's look at all of the S2C2F requirements and mark them as an objective security outcome or a subjective security outcome. So an example is that, like, knowing if your dependencies have vulnerabilities or malware. That was an S2C2F requirement. That is objectively a good outcome. You should be scanning for vulnerabilities. However, one of the other requirements was, like, have an incident response plan. That is subjective in nature because, you know, the quality of the plan is unknown, right? And so that was an exercise that we went through to really try to focus on what are the objective security outcomes that we really want to convey when we bring this into SLSA. Next, we had to design it with both open source and enterprises in mind. So in S2C2F, if you remember that wheel, we used to tell everybody to start with ingestion, that you really need to gain positive control of how developers are consuming dependencies. Because if you don't standardize how developers are consuming their dependencies, then how can you ever gain control of your supply chain? So that was like a core principle of S2C2F, but inside the dependency track, we recognized that we needed to start with inventory. That's an equally important outcome that needed to be achieved and was achievable by both open source and enterprises alike. And so going forward, because we are here to tell you that the SLSA dependency track is here, so what's going to happen with S2C2F? The S2C2F is going to live on. It's going to be rebranded as a supplemental guidance, right? It's going to talk about all the things, all of those subjective security outcomes that are still best practices, like having an incident response plan. So one last key difference I wanted to point out between S2C2F and SLSA Dependency Track is this is a picture of the S2C2F maturity levels. And their levels were focused around themes. And when you start looking down the column, you can see that each level had just a grab bag of requirements from different practices. So there wasn't focus on what needed to be accomplished. And that is exactly one of the core principles of SLSA, is that every level that you achieve has a singular outcome. And so we went from this kind of like mishmash of requirements to a much more focused, this is what you're doing at each level. And I'm going to pass the baton to Tom, who's going to tell you all about the dependency track.
Thanks, Adrian. Okay, I get the fun bit, so I can just talk about what we've actually produced. So this is hot off the press. I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview of what these levels mean. I'm not going into too much depth, and you'll see why at the end. So we have 4 levels. There are different tracks within SLSA, as Medair mentioned earlier. So build track, I think, it's got 3. Source track will have maybe a different number. These levels are independent of each other within the tracks. So that's something that's kind of important to note. Now, you see there is level 0. So it should be pretty easy to attain. Doesn't give you much. Gives you a pretty sick goose. So really the fun starts at level 1. And this is really a bare bones ground layer for everything that happens afterwards, which is having a complete inventory. So really the requirement is maintain an inventory or have an inventory of your dependencies that are in your project or in the artifact that you're going to be distributing. Now, it's quite clear, if you don't know what you depend on, you cannot mitigate risks. You can't manage what you don't measure. If you don't have visibility, how will you find problems, all those sorts of things. And so the outcome here really should be that you have good visibility into what your dependencies are. It allows you to do a lot of things, but really the TLDR is you should be able to answer the question, do you depend on this package? That should be a basic question to answer with this first level. Now, once you have good visibility of your dependencies, you can start to examine those dependencies and scrutinize them within your SDLC. And this level is all about ensuring that you understand the exposure or the risk of the dependencies you are shipping with your artifact. There are, I guess, old regulations and perhaps news articles that will have suggested things like, let's ship your software with no vulnerabilities, or CV-free software, which I think most people by now have realized is somewhat unattainable and maybe even a myth, sometimes even counterproductive to make those sorts of statements. And this is not the intention of this level. This level is it's designed to ensure that you know what you're shipping and you have options. Once you've triaged those vulnerabilities, you've identified with the dependencies you do have what CVs they have, what vulnerabilities they're exposed to. You can decide, do I need to remediate these? Are there mitigating circumstances or mitigating controls? Will I patch these in the next release? Do I need to do a hot patch? There are lots of options here, but fundamentally, you should at least know what risk your consumers of your software are going to be exposed to potentially by shipping this. And what you'll see when you actually look at the dependency track as a whole, you see there are examples of ways of achieving this, and these tie into other themes that you've heard throughout the day and throughout this week. Things like Vex provide a really good way of meeting some of these requirements, and for the previous track, SBOMs, for example. So whilst there are a lot of ways to achieve these, there are some pretty readily available tools, whether you're an enterprise or an open source project, that let you attain these. It then starts to get a little bit more complex, and this is to start to attack some of the bigger threats that were mentioned and more severe threats that were mentioned at this start. So this is all about where your dependencies come from for your project. Without meeting this, you're likely just pulling dependencies directly from the internet, directly from an upstream package manager or a source, building with them and sending them straight out to your users. There are a lot of risks involved in that. Availability risks is a big one, right? So LeftPad's a really notable incident where it was no longer available and people broke. Having control over that source is a very important thing to have. And you can achieve this in several ways, standing up your own artifact repository, local mirror, those sorts of things. But it allows you to maintain continuity regardless of what's happening upstream with you. It's also a prerequisite to be able to achieve the fourth level, which is, I think, one of our coolest and probably most contentious ones, because there are a lot of ways of dealing with this. But starting to have some defenses against those upstream attacks that we've seen happen. Now, this is really all about you having a way of enforcing some level of secure ingestion over what you are pulling in from those upstreams. Those threats that were mentioned earlier, again, malicious attacks on upstream, typo squats, dependency confusion, a malicious takeover of projects, all these sorts of things are pretty viable attacks. But by adopting certain controls in this place, you can really reduce your exposure to those upstream attacks by having some sort of layer or bubble between, again, your internal, your producer-controlled artifact repository and the upstream. There's a lot more detail. Everyone gets their phones out right now, scans this, otherwise we're locking the doors, I think. This is here, this is a living, breathing draft. It's got a lot more detail than we had time to go into today. You're going to see a lot more, and I will go back to that at the end because we really want you to scan this. It is in draft. Obviously, ultimate goal is to publish this as part of a future release of SLSA specification. We're considering adding some additional things as well, including addressing end-of-life issues and things like that. But we're really going to need people's support, so we really would like you to get involved. We have meetings. Please join us. We're very friendly. We're very eager to get support. And of course, you can join us using all of the usual channels for engaging with the OpenSSF as well. I'm going back to the QR code. Embed it in your minds. Thank you very much.
Anyone have any questions for the SLSA team? Yeah.
This is incredibly exciting. SLSA tracks can be a bit of a journey through sort of like ideation to specification to tooling to help people achieve that specification. Do you have any thoughts about tooling, any sort of cross-collaborative work streams happening as to how organizations can achieve these levels?
Yeah, I think as a part of this process, as we were coming up with some of those requirements, what was cool is that we've observed that our companies internally were already practicing a lot of those things, right? And so there was already a bit of precedent in how we implemented those things. But yeah, there's a lot of opportunity to work with artifact registry solutions, right? Artifact management solution to provide some of the features more natively, right? Such as ingestion delay, etc. But yeah, this is the next big step for us, is to figure out what is the compliance, automated compliance verification, etc. looks like for this.
I'd also like to just reiterate what Tom mentioned. Level 1 is inventory. One way to achieve that is with an SBOM. There are other ways to achieve it, but SBOMs have already been well socialized across our industry. There's plenty of open source and commercial options for producing an SBOM today. And level 2 was also about triaging vulnerabilities. And VEX as a concept has tooling and specifications out there as well. And so those are exciting ways that organizations can provide verifiable attestations to their downstream consumers.
I would say it might be overly ambitious, but this time next year, you should be able to go from room to room and tend to talk about an open source tool that tells you it can help you accomplish one of those levels. I don't think it's that unrealistic with what we've already got so far.
Questions?
Can you talk a little bit about the process of joining two projects together into one? Has it been like a cordial, collegiate experience? Have there been, any kind of conflict? I mean, I would imagine, these are two very passionate groups of maintainers for each of these projects.
We can't stand each other now.
I would say it was a long time coming. When SLSA came out, it had the threat picture that's very famous and has been reused, and it shows dependencies on there. And then S2C2F showed up in OpenSSF and kind of said, oh, well, we've got that piece of your picture covered. And so there's been a little bit of like, how do we coexist? And I think it just took a lot of time for us to kind of come around to the idea that like, we shouldn't live separately. We should just make this easier on our customers. It's the right thing for OpenSSF to do, to take its portfolio and kind of merge it for the ease of use of everybody, the improved experience, the discoverability of the guidance, all of the above.
And all of the meetings are recorded from the very, very beginning, so you can all go check what the vibe is. It's very friendly.
I would just say as a follow-up comment, thank you for doing that kind of yeoman's work for the customers.